Let's dive into a topic that's been widely misunderstood and has been doing the rounds again recently, namely Aisha's age at the time of marrying the Prophet ﷺ. A lot of people have heard or even assert that she was 6 or 9, but there's a lot to indicate that this is not the case. Now, despite having written and published 2 books on Aisha, I have to admit I have barely addressed this issue because I felt the discourse was one set by Islamophobes and that really the Muslims know better by now. However, when you look at statistics on child marriage in the world today and some of the horrific opinions currently being expressed by certain folk on social media, I realise this issue still needs tackling head on. And we can tackle this in a number of ways, so let's start with the hadith. So you've probably heard that Sahih al-Bukhari has a few reports saying Aisha was 6 years old at marriage and 9 years old at consummation. But here's where it gets interesting. This particular narration is almost exclusively traced back to one source, Hisham ibn Urwa, and he only began narrating it after he moved to Iraq. He had lived in Medina for 71 years before moving to Iraq and did not make this statement until he was 90 years old. Not only did his memory reportedly decline in Iraq, but Medinan scholars who knew Hisham earlier didn't report this version of Aisha's age. Even Imam Malik, who was a peer of Hashim's when he lived in Medina and one of the most rigorous early scholars, does not have such a narration in his own work Al-Muwatta. So that raises some serious questions about its reliability. Additionally, later scholars like Ibn Hajar and Al-Dhahabi also noted that Hisham's reports from Iraq had issues with reliability due to loss of memory and confusion in his old age, so the source of this narration doesn't have the weight that we might think. Similar hadith also recorded in Bukhari are narrated by men who were similarly reliable narrators who became unreliable in their later years. For example, Ali ibn Mushir al-Kufi. In short, all narrations about Aisha's age in Sahih al-Bukhari come from Iraq, and most narrators involved were considered mudallisin, meaning they engaged in tadlis, obscuring the source of narration by traditionists' own standards. This significantly impacts the reliability of these reports. Okay, now let's consider Aisha's age based on key life events. Historian Muhammad ibn Ishaq and other early sources like Ibn Hisham and Ibn Kathir list Aisha as part of the very first group of people to accept Islam in the first year of the Prophet ﷺ's mission. Now, if Aisha accepted Islam as a young child in the first year, she couldn't have been 6 years old when her marriage was officiated, as some suggest. Here's the timeline issue. The Prophet ﷺ stayed in Mecca for 13 years after his mission began. Then another year and a half passed after the Hijrah, after the migration to Medina, before his marriage with Aisha. So if she joined Islam at the very start, and to do so, she needs to have had the sense to know she was converting to a new faith. In other words, she couldn't have been too young in the first place. She'd have been in her late teens by the marriage, definitely not 6 or 9. Now, At-Tabari adds a further evidence by saying all of Abu Bakr, Aisha's father, all of Abu Bakr's kids, including Aisha, were born before Islam. If she was born pre-Islam, she'd have been around 16 at her engagement and a bit older when she joined the Prophet ﷺ's household, about 18. Tabari also reported that at the time that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu planned to migrate to Habsha, to Ethiopia, which was 8 years before Hijrah, he went to Mut'am, whose son Aisha was engaged to, and asked him to take Aisha in his house as his son's wife. But Mut'am refused because Abu Bakr had embraced Islam and his family had not, and so they broke off the engagement. Now, if Aisha was only 6 years old at the time of her marriage, she could not have even been born when Abu Bakr decided to migrate to Habsha, to Ethiopia. Then there's her sister Asma. We know from historians that Asma was 10 years older than Aisha. Asma died aged 100 years old in the year 73 after Hijrah. So if we do the calculations, that means that she was 27 years old at the time of Hijrah, which would have made Aisha at that time 17. And that's way more consistent with Aisha having the maturity and responsibilities we read about in her early years in Medina as well. All in all, the maths just doesn't add up for Aisha to have been 6 or 9 And the sources, the timelines, and the context really point to her being older. And if that's not enough, there's the issue of interpreting cultural language, meaning there's also the idea that Aisha's age could have been described with a cultural figure of speech. Now, the Pakistani scholar Javed Ahmed Ghamidi suggests that when Aisha said 6, as is recorded in Bukhari, it might have actually meant 16, as shorthand was common in Arabic speech. Now, we see the Prophet ﷺ using similar phrasing actually in describing the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, as one of the last 10 days of Ramadan, when he said to seek it out on the 9th, 7th, and 5th in the Arabic. But no one ever disputes that this is understood to mean 29th, 27th, and 25th. So it's very possible that 6 and 9 in these narrations could hold symbolic or contextual meanings that don't translate directly. And these are just some of the historical and contextual arguments. The discussion around Aisha's age isn't just about numbers, it's about understanding Islamic values of consent, maturity, and compassion in marriage. We have a moral obligation to reinvestigate claims like these when ignoring them means there are people in the world who will continue to cite Aisha's age to justify child marriage or argue some sort of cultural relativism on what constitutes a child in Islam.